We are entering a time of maximum tension. These days could mark a before and after for Ukraine. And no, I'm not just saying that because of the summit this Friday that will bring Trump and Putin together in Alaska, which is already explosive enough on its own. I'm saying it because in the last few hours, something absolutely momentous may have happened. After months in which Kyiv has received increasingly timid, scarce, and far less ambitious military support, Putin's troops appear to have broken through the front line in Donetsk, right in the heart of the Donbass. The latest reports suggest that Moscow may have achieved a significant breakthrough just before the two most powerful men in Russia and the United States sit down face to face. But what is really going on? What could this summit in Alaska mean? What exactly is Ukraine's current situation? All this and more is what we're going to look at next. So let's get started. VisualPolitik community, the difference in the number of soldiers available between Russia and Ukraine is becoming enormous. Putin's troops are launching almost constant assaults, like clockwork, one after another, without rest. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians can barely rotate their men at the front. And of course, exhaustion is beginning to take its toll. On top of that comes another problem, the lack of delivery of weapons that could truly make a difference. What can I tell you? Since Trump arrived at the White House, the delivery of military equipment to Kyiv has been significantly reduced. And Moscow, of course, knows this. That's why they are now sparing no effort, while the Ukrainians grow more and more exhausted. Here, as I say, the difference shows. After more than an estimated 1 million casualties, wounded and dead combined, in the almost 3.5 years of war so far, Russia continues pushing day and night. And in recent months, they've been doing it with even greater intensity. Because it's often said that the war in Ukraine is stalled. And yes, that's partly true, but that phrase also hides a very different reality. The lines are not frozen. Meter by meter, the Russians are trying to advance westward every single day. Although there's a trick here that we'll talk about later. And for now, they are succeeding. Even though the Russian summer offensive hasn't made big headlines, passing almost unnoticed, the truth is that it's been a steady advance. In the last week alone, for example, they took control of nearly 144 square kilometers, almost half of that in the surroundings of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is not just a point on the map. It was a city of 60,000 inhabitants, and right now, it could play a key role in the outcome of the entire war. Think about it. It's an important railway and road hub that connects much of the front, so controlling it would give the Russians much easier troop and supply logistics, and for the Ukrainians, losing it would mean having their supply lines choked. That's why many military analysts have issued a stark warning. If Pokrovsk falls, defending what's left of Donetsk will become much harder for Ukraine, which, VisualPolitik community, could trigger a domino effect across the whole region. To stop the advance, Kyiv has had to deploy one of its most valuable cards, the 1st Azov Corps of the National Guard, a unit created not long ago, on April 15th of this very year, and designed to carry out major operations. And make no mistake, this isn't just any formation. This corps is well equipped. It has tanks, artillery, anti-air defenses, next-generation drones, and most importantly, a complete structure that allows it to independently carry out large-scale offensive and defensive actions. Its brigades are also made up of units with extensive combat experience. In other words, we're talking about a full-on elite force. And what does that mean? Well, it means Kyiv has had to put some of its best troops on the table to stop the Russian advance that could endanger the entire Eastern Front. But there's a problem. Even with the 1st Azov Corps on the ground, in the last few hours, the Russians seem to have broken through Ukrainian defenses, and that, as we've already said, could put the entire Eastern Front in jeopardy. The information coming in is still limited, unclear. There really isn't much detail yet, but the signs aren't good. Everything suggests that the situation is becoming, at the very least, unsettling.
The situation is quite chaotic, as the enemy, having identified gaps in the defense, is infiltrating deep into the territory, seeking to rapidly consolidate its positions and build up forces for further advances.
We'll be keeping a close eye on events. But the fact is, all of this is happening just a few days before the Trump-Putin summit, which logically has set off all the alarms. Because think about it, what incentive would Putin have to give up anything if his troops seem to be speeding up the occupation? Does a genuine willingness to reach a peace agreement really exist? Then why does everything point to Russia doing exactly the opposite? That is, preparing to launch new offensives. Well, I think it's time to go over a few key points so we don't lose track of this whole story. Let's take a look.
The most awaited summit.
Now, obviously, no one knows what's going to happen when Trump and Putin sit down in Alaska. But you know what? The precedents are not exactly encouraging. In the summer of 2018, during his first term, Trump already met with the Russian president. They came face to face in Helsinki, and what can I say? Many described that meeting as a downright humiliation for the United States. And the scene was something else. Trump practically bought the entire narrative of the Russian president. And even when a journalist asked the US president who he trusted more, his own intelligence services or Putin, Trump, without hesitation, said, Putin. Incredible, but true. Things got so crazy that Republican Senator and presidential candidate John McCain had this to say about that day, and mind you, he didn't mince words.
One of the most disgraceful performances by an American president in memory. No prior president has ever abased himself more abjectly before a tyrant.
You could hardly say it any louder or any clearer. Then former CIA Director John Brennan went even further and described Trump's behavior as outright treason.
Donald Trump's press conference performance in Helsinki rises to and exceeds the threshold of high crimes and misdemeanors. It was nothing short of treasonous.
And these are just two examples. In general, the reactions, including those from the most senior Republican officials at the time, were strikingly strong, blunt, and deeply critical. Trump, for whatever reason, seems to have a fascination with Putin, and that's exactly what we saw in 2018. And it's exactly what many fear we might see again now. That's why there are those who believe that the summit in Alaska will be nothing more than an outright sellout of the Ukrainians. Although I insist, of course, we can't know for sure. Maybe that's how it will be, or maybe Trump will pull a great, fantastic, incredible, wonderful deal out of his hat. You know, pure Trumpian terms. The truth is that so far things haven't gotten off to a good start. The US president has given a press conference in which he spoke about this summit and about Ukraine, and once again he's said things that are hard to believe. Among them, gems like this one.
They would have been in Kiev in 4 hours, going down the highway. But a Russian general made a brilliant decision to go through the farmland instead. And they just had torrential rains, and the rains were so bad, and it was mud, and those tanks got stuck in the mud. I don't know who that general is, but knowing Vladimir, he's probably not around any longer. I was a little bothered by the fact that Zelensky was saying, well, I have to get constitutional approval. I mean, he's got approval to go into war and kill everybody, but he needs approval to do a land swap, because there'll be some land swapping to the good, for the good of Ukraine.
The reality, of course, was quite different. If the Russians didn't reach Kyiv, it was because of the brutal resistance put up by the Ukrainians, not because of a bad decision by a general. Of course, he also said he was going to Russia this Friday. And no, he's not going to Russia. The summit this time is in Alaska. But alright, with that said, regarding this summit, what exactly do we know? And what's most worrying about it? Well, pay attention, because this is going to be absolutely key to understanding everything that's coming in the next few days.
What we know.
Beyond the outcome, which we'll obviously have to wait for, there are a few things we already know. First, regardless of what is or isn't agreed in Alaska, the mere image of Trump and Putin negotiating the future of Ukraine alone, and in a way, of all Europe, is already a crushing blow for Kyiv. Many are directly calling it an infinite humiliation. Because think about it, it's the Ukrainians who have borne the sacrifice, the deaths, the pain, and now they're being treated like little children pushed away from the table. For Putin, on the other hand, this is a triumph in every sense. The Russian president has spent years saying that this is a war between Russia and the West, and that Ukraine is nothing more than a pawn, a puppet. And of course, leaving them in the corner while the adults negotiate the real issues is a textbook political goal for the Kremlin. Moreover, as we've told you countless times, a ceasefire is not enough for Ukraine. It needs guarantees for its future. That's why Zelensky keeps insisting on messages like this one.
Any decisions made against us, any decisions made without Ukraine, are at the same time decisions against peace. They will bring nothing. These are dead decisions. They will never work.
And not only that, from the Ukrainian government, there are leaks saying that they're alarmed that Trump may want to exclude them. And many analysts point out the risk that this could echo the Munich Agreement of 1938. You know, the famous deal between Hitler, Chamberlain, Mussolini, and Daladier to negotiate the future of Czechoslovakia without the Czech government even being present. In any case, for Putin, this means not only painting the Ukrainians as puppets, but also being able to negotiate with Trump a solution that suits him, and then hand it over to Ukraine already cooked and ready.
We're not quite back at February the 28th in the Oval Office when Trump told Zelensky, "You don't have any cards." But what's happening is that Russia and the United States are discussing what terms they're going to present to Zelensky, and it may well be that Zelensky has no choice.
Secondly, for the Europeans, all of this is yet another embarrassment. One more in a list that, let's be honest, is already getting far too long. Because look, the summit will be held in the United States. No European delegation has been invited. Trump will decide what gets negotiated and what doesn't, while it's the future of the old continent that's on the line. And all this despite the fact that Europeans have shouldered a huge share of the political, economic, and military cost of this war. So what can I say? The scene feels like something from another era, as if the Cold War had never ended. Two superpowers, if you can even call Russia that, sitting down to carve up Eastern Europe like it's a game of Risk, as if Europeans had nothing to say about it. And what are the ones affected doing? Well, they've set up a couple of virtual meetings to define their position. Meetings where Zelensky will be present, and in one of them they've invited Trump, but it's not even clear whether he'll join. Ridiculous. Maybe yes, maybe no. At the White House, there's little concern about responding to the invitation. In any case, Europe's position was clear. No recognition of Russia's occupation of Ukrainian territory. No negotiations without a prior ceasefire. And Ukraine always at the table. So Trump has completely ignored all three of these demands. And not only that, the situation is so outrageous that Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy to negotiate with Putin, hasn't even given Europeans a clear account of what he has agreed with the Russians. Nothing new under the sun. Thirdly, this is the first time since 2007, yes, in 18 years, that the United States has officially invited a Russian leader to the country outside the framework of the United Nations. A gesture that, in theory, is usually accompanied by some sign of goodwill from the guest, in this case, Moscow, if there's truly any intention to reach an agreement. Well, here, nothing at all. No gesture, no concession, no change of tone, nothing. Quite the opposite. As we saw at the start of this video, Russia is in the middle of a military offensive. The United States, on the other hand, has indeed given way on something. On what? Well, don't forget that Trump issued an ultimatum. If by August 8th the fighting hadn't stopped, or serious steps hadn't been taken toward an imminent ceasefire, he would impose enormous sanctions and tariffs. The result? No ceasefire, no sanctions, nothing of the sort. And VisualPolitik community, fourthly, there's also been a leak of the offer that Russia has apparently put on the table.
Putin tells US he'll halt war in exchange for eastern Ukraine.
Basically, the Russian president has barely shifted his position.
There are no obvious indications that Putin is rethinking his strategy of grinding Ukraine down through attrition, while accepting moderate but bearable pain for Russia from Western sanctions.
So, according to what's being reported, the offer is as follows: a ceasefire in Ukraine, but not a comprehensive peace agreement, as long as the following condition is met. Recognition by all parties of Russia's territorial gains, including areas not currently occupied, from which Ukraine would have to withdraw in the Donbass. From there, the front line would be frozen frozen in the rest of the territory. The plan would also include the gradual lifting of sanctions on Russia and Ukraine's non-accession to NATO, although the delivery of weapons to Ukraine would still be allowed. And here's the kicker. Trump has been clear. There will be a territorial exchange. In other words, the Russians might hand back some occupied enclave in exchange for Ukraine giving them part of its own country. For its part, Zelensky's government appears to be saying it supports freezing the war at the current borders, but under no circumstances will it cede new territory. But of course, all this has naturally sparked certain fears.
The fear.
VisualPolitik community, we don't know what will happen in Alaska. We know what we've told you. Putin's win, Europe's diplomatic fiasco, the complete lack of goodwill gestures from the Kremlin, and the plan they seem to have put on the table for the Americans. In Moscow, they seem convinced that the lack of US support for Ukraine will cause the Ukrainian front to collapse within a couple of months, according to a source with access to the Russian general staff who spoke to Reuters. And of course, with that diagnosis, it's possible Putin feels emboldened, though he also has his own problems. In any case, this whole story has triggered certain fears. First, the Ukrainians want nothing to do with ceding new territories to the Russians, because basically that would be justifying the war, short-term relief for long-term disaster. On top of that, Zelensky has been very clear, the constitution does not allow it. And besides, the Ukrainian people don't support such a move. And look, according to a recent survey by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, more than 3/4 of Ukrainians oppose transferring any new territory to Russia. The problem is that the meeting between Trump and Putin could result in them presenting Ukraine with a fully closed plan, and the alternative being the suspension of US aid. That's a scenario that also sparks fear, because the Ukrainians are well aware that Putin's goal is to reach an agreement that leaves Ukraine indefensible, uninvestable, and on a path to implosion as a country. And that's why there's a lot of fear that Putin will play Trump and win him over. And finally, there's another problem. Remember how I told you at the start of the video that Russia is advancing little by little, day after day, desperately but steadily? Well, even if it surprises you, this is actually part of Ukraine's plan. Let me explain. In Ukraine, they still believe that, just like in Vietnam, just like with Napoleon when he invaded Russia, and even with George Washington, the best defensive strategy is constant attrition. That is, letting Russia advance, but at such a high cost that sooner or later it leads to their implosion, whether military, economic, or political. In other words, for some time now, the Ukrainian goal has not been to hold every centimeter of territory at all costs, but to make each successive advance so costly for the Russians that it breaks them. This is partly because they believe Russia's problem has only one solution. Either they are defeated, or Ukraine will have no future as a country. All the more so given that Europe is rapidly increasing its military capacity. Right now, according to the Financial Times, there are more than 7 million square meters, or 2.7 square miles, of new military industrial development underway on the old continent. A historic rearmament process that will allow them to supply Ukraine in the future. In other words, time could be on Ukraine's side. I know it's easy to say that from a distance, but it does seem to be the Ukrainian plan. And what's the problem? They fear that a false exit could be worse than this scenario. A scenario that, for example, has caused the Moscow Stock Exchange to skyrocket.
Russian stocks rise to 3-month highs ahead of Trump-Putin meeting.
So that's where things stand. Now all we can do is wait and hope the stars align and that Trump doesn't end up throwing away years of heroic resistance for a political point. But now that we've come this far, the question is, what do you believe will be agreed upon at this summit? Leave your opinions in the comments and let's open up the debate. And now if you found this video interesting, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to VisualPolitik. Thanks for watching and good luck to Ukraine. All the best, see you next time.